if this has already been recorded, so we have already started, or otherwise we can start the recording maybe. And again, I am really happy to open this webinar today with Professor Yan Chen from the University of Michigan. She will talk to us about virtual teams in a gig economy, which is a very interesting and appealing abstract that you can read below here. So, but before we go to the webinar, very quickly some announcements concerning next challenges or appointments for the Decisionalized Society, starting with Yale, Grushka Cocaine, and the ADA 2022 conference. Yale, the floor is yours. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. It's great to see names and I want to say faces, but I'm seeing kind of Zoom pictures, and I'm excited for the seminar, and I don't want to take too much of our time. Let me quickly go into presentation mode. I just want to make a couple of brief announcements, given that we're coming here together as a society, and this is recorded and it will be shared. So you may have received an email from me calling for announcements or calling for nominations for our council member. We have two council member positions that will become vacant, come informs later in the fall, October, November this year. So if you're interested in getting more involved, if you've always wondered what it would be like, if you know of individuals that are primed to get more involved and to get to know more people and work with more people, please send them my way, because we're looking for great nominations. We're looking for 2 positions to fill. So it would be great to have a handful of candidates, not only for this election period, but also for any future one. So please, please, please send us your recommendations. You can send it to me, or you can send it to Emanuela, or anybody from the Decision Analysis Society that you are that you know. And thank you to all of the other members that have been serving so passionately and engaging so vibrantly. So that's the first announcement. Second announcement is we have ADA in the works. This is just a plug to put it on your calendar. It's coming next year. We've had Milan, which was amazing last time, pre-COVID. We had Austin, Texas. We had DC, and we're going back to DC in 2022. Manel and I will be part of the hosting committee, but there's a whole slew of individuals involved. It's just kind of put a save the date kind of out there. We will send more details pending later in the summer. September, we will open up the submissions, and then later in the year, there's some key dates that you may want to take note of, but just put it out there so everybody's aware of it. And that's about it. That's all I have to say. I will stop sharing. I just wanted to make sure that people, start creating the buzz around future activities. Enjoy the seminar, the webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yael. And now I can use also some announcements, but I will be very, very, very quick, so we can go directly then to our wonderful speaker. So sorry to take this minute of your time. Let's remember that we have the Decisionalized Society for Risk Analysis conference on emerging risks virtually in June 22nd, 23rd, 2021. Deadline is approaching. Also, we have deadlines approaching for our awards. If you want to submit recommendations for the DAS Publication Award, the deadline for the nomination is June 1st, so 10 days from now. We have the DAS Practice Award, which deadline will be later on in July 2021. The Best Student Paper Award, however, the deadline is July 15, 2021. So here are our award committees. For the Best Decision Analysis Publication Award, we have Richard John and Jay Simon. For the DAS Student Paper Award, Esa Pale and Mehmet Ayvaci. So you can write to them for nominations or other questions. And for the DAS Practice Award, we have Valentina Ferretti, Gilberto Montipelle, Nadia Papamichail, and John Anderson. Sorry for the typo there. And not a member of the Decision Analysis yet, a recall to become a member. And now we are at our webinar. Professor Yan Chen is the Daniel Kahneman Collegiate Professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan and Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Faculty of Economics at Tsinghua University. She has an amazing record of publication and wide research interest, especially in experimental economics, market and mechanism designs. She's published in outstanding journals comprising Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Management Science, and currently she is Associate Editor of Management Science. I leave the floor immediately to Yan Chen with a really big thank for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to leave the floor to you and to your webinar. Thank you, Yan.
Thank you, Emanuela, for the very gracious introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming. So my preference for the webinar is that if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and raise it. So it's more like sort of a seminar feeling. So if it's going to take a long time to answer, I'm just going to defer it to the end. So I'll try to wrap up and leave about 10 minutes at the end for more general Q&A. So I'm going to present two field experiments, but focusing on the second one. So they're about virtual teams in a gig economy. And this is joined with our fantastic student co-author, Ten Ye, who's the first author in the second experiment, who will be an assistant professor at Minnesota in the fall. And co-authors from computer science, Qiaozhu Mei and Jieping Ye, who's the AI labs, the former director of the AI labs. Wei Ai was our previous doctoral student who's at Maryland now as an assistant professor. So I will briefly motivate the gig economy and its problems. So I consider academia as a traditional sector. So for workers in traditional sectors, we derive part of our identity from work. And at least before the pandemic, we had lots of opportunities to bond with coworkers, and hopefully that's coming back. And there's also a very well-defined career trajectory. So from assistant professors to tenured associate to full professor and so on. In comparison, gig workers has a different set of issues. The earlier research work tend to focus on the autonomy and flexibility of work, but more recently there has been, more and more evidence that there is a lack of work identity and opportunities to bond with coworkers. So the New Yorker had a fairly extensive set of interviews in one of the issues with gig workers. And so, for instance, a tasker for TaskRabbit said that, after I resigned from my high school teacher position, I started to work for TaskRabbit. Each day I wake up, the algorithm assigns some jobs to me. I would go ahead and finish them, and the next day the algorithm assigns some other jobs to me. And it's the same thing every day. And he said that these are jobs that don't lead to anything. There's also a wonderful book by sociologist Ravenel that came out in 2019, where she interviewed 80 gig workers from 4 platforms in North America and documented attrition and lack of engagement as fairly prevalent problems. So we're going to conduct our experiment on a ride-sharing platform, which is called Didi, which is the largest ride-sharing platform in the world. So all the numbers I'm going to cite are from December 2019 because everything's different in 2020, and hopefully things will be back to normal, towards the end of this year. So Didi employs 31 million drivers globally, and most of the drivers in China are migrant workers or the unemployed and underemployed. There's a third class of Didi drivers that they're not in our subject pool, and we're not going to study them. These are commuters who offer a ride to someone on the way to work and give someone a ride, on the way home. And so interviews with Didi drivers also have similar issues. So for instance, a Didi driver said, I have no interaction or relationship with other colleagues. So it's a very lonely job. Just as a comparison, these are the numbers from Uber and Lyft. So Didi is larger than Uber and Lyft combined. So the reason we were involved in these field experiments was because Jieping Ye, who's one of our co-authors, was a faculty member at the University of Michigan, and he became the director of AI labs in Didi. While he was the director, he had a set of call for proposals joined with the Michigan Institute for Data Science. And one of the problems that he presented was driver attrition, so lack of engagement and attrition. And so Qiaozhou and I submitted a proposal, and we proposed to use essentially an identity-based solution to organize virtual teams on the platform. So the goal is to increase driver engagement and productivity. So I'm not going to, probably contrary to lots of studies presented before, I'm not going to present theory this time, but I want to say that our experiment is based on social identity theory, which had a long tradition in social psychology and identity economics, starting from Akerlof and Crenton, and is now a growing field within economics. The third theory field that we build on is context theory, which is, largely game theoretic analysis of conflict and elections, but we apply it to organization design here. So for the empirical side, I'm not going to present, but I want to point out that there's a long tradition of both lab and field experiments using identity-based approaches to increase public goods provision or increase productivity or engagement. And I also wanted to point out 3 recent surveys with some shameless self-advertisement on identity and teams. So there is a large emerging literature on ride-sharing economy, or the gig economy in general. And not surprisingly, because one of the very productive experimental economists, John Liss, was the chief economist at Uber, and now he's the chief economist at Lyft. So lots of these studies use either Uber or Lyft data. And they vary from estimating the value of flexible work to consumer surplus, the economics of apologies and so on. I want to point out one paper, which is under the review process, by Tracy Liu, who's one of my former students, and her co-authors, that use Didi data to estimate the dynamic matching efficiency on the platform. So our papers are different in the sense that they put organization and social relationships into the gig economy. So it's addressing a different set of problems. So I won't have time to go into detail for both experiments, but I want to mention the first experiment because it sets a lot of constraints on the second experiment, which is my main focus. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the sociology of conducting field experiments in online platforms. So the first experiment was led by Wei Ai, who was our doctoral student at the time. So when we submitted our proposal to the Didi AI Labs, they gave us a city, which is the southern city of Dongguan, and said, you can try out your virtual teams idea here. So we organized 21 drivers into virtual teams, and the team size was 7 because some of these parameters were set sort of arbitrarily, but they became binding constraints for our subsequent experiments. So we set a team size of 7 drivers because the contest, went for 5 days. So there's some slack about, perhaps some drivers might not be able to drive all 5 days, and it's a contest for cash prize. So what's neat about this experiment is the team formation algorithm. So in our previous experiments with organization teams, such as our experiments on kiva.org, the teams were already there, so we cannot do much about it. So the team structure were, endogenous. They were formed by different people. So the team formation were endogenous. This is a place because the platform was completely flat. The organization, there was no organization structure. We could actually go in and organize teams from scratch. So we used 5 different algorithms for team formation. So you can think of these as, your standard recommender algorithms. 3 of the algorithms are based on homophily. So their hometown similarity, if you are from the same province, you're organized into the same team. Age similarity is if you're born in the same decade. Productivity similarity was based on the number of trips 2 weeks prior to the start of our experiment. The reason for using hometown and age similarity was because in the Chinese context, these are 2 very salient natural identities. So the Chinese provinces roughly correspond to the ancient kingdoms before China was unified in 221 BC. So each province has its distinct dialect, food, and lots of interesting characteristics. And there are also 2 algorithms based on diversity. One is productivity diversity, which is Didi's preferred algorithm. So the reason they wanted to try out productivity diversity was because, there was a hope that more productive drivers can teach less productive drivers. So the way the algorithm works here is we sort drivers by their productivity, put them in 7 different bins, and each team consists of members who are randomly drawn, 1 from each bin. And then there is a completely randomly formed teams. So these are, as far as I know, this is probably the first field experiment with completely randomly, exogenously formed teams. So for the team contest, we use Fu et al.'s theory, which is team contests with pairwise battles, and we also vary the prize structure. So I'm just going to lay out the main results and continue to the second experiment. So what we find is that during these 5 days of contest, the average treatment effect was 12%, and that was driven by, on average, drivers in teams work 46 minutes longer per day. But there are, about 60% of the teams which we define as responsive teams. And the reason we know was because we give each team captain a questionnaire before the start of the contest. And it consists of questions where we know the ground truth, and you won't know it off the top of your head, which is, the last 3 digits of your teammates' license plate number, the distance of their birthplace to the contest city, and so on. We find that, we'll give them the cell phone numbers of the drivers in their team, and you have to actually call them up to be able to fill out this questionnaire, and 60% of the teams did so. So for responsive teams, the productivity increase was 19%, and that translates into 1.2 hours longer workday per day. So that points to the importance of communications, and we also checked whether there were more accidents during the contest period, whether the quality of service, which is indicated by consumer ratings, are the same. It turns out that these didn't change. And the team composition, the other result is that team composition actually affect productivity. So hometown similarity teams are more likely to be responsive, and age similarity teams are more productive than randomly formed teams 2 weeks after the contest was over. So not surprisingly, these 2 algorithms were taken by Didi and shipped to production, and they become constraints for our second experiments. So one question that we were not able to answer were whether these effects are driven by team identity or cash prize. Because both were present in the experiment, we find that there is some indication that it's not all for cash prize, in the sense that treated drivers continue to be more productive 2 weeks after the contest. And also in the survey and interview data, so after the experiment, Wei and some DD staff went to Dongguan and interviewed the drivers. Lots of drivers really like the contest because they said, I came from the countryside to the city to find work, and I didn't know anyone before. So the teams, my team enabled me to find friends from my hometown, my province.
Yan,
So,
can I?
Go
so
ahead.
this is Manel Baucells. Along this point that you are commenting now, the DD driver is still by himself or herself while driving. So what was the exact interaction with the members? Did they meet for coffee, or did they have a chat, way to chat among themselves, or what was it?
Yeah, thank you. So based on our interview data and also survey data, I mean, the response rate was only 25%, but that they started to meet off work, so actually meeting in person. And they also had the WeChat group, which is the social media app, the WeChat group, where they exchange information. So these are the two main mode of communications that we know of from our data. Does that answer your question, Manel?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just turn to the second experiment. So did you really like this experiment, this pilot experiment, if you will? In 2018 alone, so the year after our experiment, the platform organized 1,500 team contests across 180 cities in China, which involve 2 million drivers. And every time they organize a contest, it's in anticipation of over demand. For instance, a national holiday is coming up, historical cities would be, full of tourists, and then they would pull out these contests and run it for a week. And after a week, they dismiss the contest, and everything's back to normal. So we argue that this is actually a wasted opportunity, because team identity should have long-term effects. So we propose the second experiment. So one feature is we take away the monetary rewards. The other one was we wanted to run it longer. So let me move to the design of the second field experiment. So the second field experiment was started in the fall of 2018. So the first stage was driver recruitment and team formation. This we did not actually have a lot of control, because they were all part of the production process. And the second stage was one of these 1 week short-term team contests for cash prize, which was, in the same format as DD had always run. Our contest, our intervention starts after the short-term contest was over. We randomized the teams into 3 different experimental conditions. So in the first condition, they see the team leaderboard, so the ranking of the teams at the end of each day. And if you tap on your team, you also see the individual leaderboard. In the second experiment treatment, they only see the individual ranking within their team. And in the control condition, things were back to normal. At the end of the day, we want to control for the same communication frequency. There's also a push message, which tells the driver how much they earned during the day. And afterwards, we had another surprise 1 week contest for cash prize as an evaluation and a post-experiment survey. So the 3 cities we used this time were Beijing, Taiyuan, and Kunming. So they're very different in the sense in both the size and and some characteristics about the order response rate. So what I would like everyone to make a mental note is the order response rates, which is, how much of the rise demanded were actually fulfilled. They were 90% in Beijing and Kunming. So this is 2 weeks before our contest started, and 98% in Kunming, which means that Kunming has very little room to grow, actually. They're also different in the number of historical contests. So the team formation process was essentially, we had 27,000 drivers from these 3 cities. So Didi used a cutoff that basically removed all the commuters. And so the participating drivers were somewhat has to meet a minimum, activity requirement in the 2 weeks prior to our contest. So within each city, we randomized them into the team leaderboard condition, the individual leaderboard, or the control condition. We use stratified random assignment, stratifying on their prior productivity. So each experimental condition had about 9,000 drivers. Drivers can volunteer to be team captains. So this is where the constraint from our prior experiment kicks in. A team has 7 members, so that sounds familiar. Drivers can volunteer to be team captains. Each captain can organize a team of 7. So if a captain completes the team, we call it, self-organized team. So that's only 36% of the teams. If a captain come up and said, okay, here are 2 members in my team, but I'm still short, then the 2 algorithms, the sort of 2 best performing algorithms from our first experiment kicks in. So the algorithm would recommend members to the incomplete teams based either on hometown similarity or age similarity. So that is 64% of the teams. So these proportions are balanced across the experimental conditions, and we control for them during the analysis.
So can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So there was no randomly assembled team in this particular experiment?
Not anymore. So this is because the randomly assembled team in the first experiment didn't do very well. So Didi eliminated it.
Okay.
So the platform basically just retained 2 algorithms from the first experiment, which is hometown similarity and age similarity.
Yan, can I ask? So it seems that what works here is the similarity, same hometown, same age. But now, like in at least, but in many places, there is now this idea of diversity and inclusion. And
yeah.
So I don't know, what do you think is the right balance between similarity and diversity based on your research?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So the question is essentially, when do you want to have diversity, and what is the extent of diversity you want to encourage? So from our prior field experiments with Kiva, when we recommend lenders, these are pro-social lenders, to Kiva teams, we can now force them to join teams. And the algorithm that worked best was location similarity. So when we say drivers who live near, not drivers, the lenders who live near you enjoy being part of these teams, the take-up rate was the highest. It seems that homophily is really good at getting strangers into groups. So this is also, I think, backed up by a lot of empirical analysis using naturally occurring data in online social networks. So one thing that I want to say is that it doesn't mean that they are not diverse in other dimensions, but so far our experiments seem to indicate that for people who are completely strangers, when you form teams, similar teams along some dimensions seem to work really well. So I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but that's
well, this is what I would have thought myself, but anyway, sometimes I do think there's a tension and there's a right. Even when we do our in MBA programs, right? Well, we talk about diversity, but they all have done the GMAT. They all are interested in business. They all have a relatively similar age range. So we talk about diversity, but within a great deal of similarity. So I think there's a nice tension there that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, so the theory paper that I can refer people to is Scott Page's paper on diversity. So he basically looked at, different types of production functions and talked about when, depending on the nature of production functions, you would want either similar or diverse teams. I think that's probably the clearest theoretical results I know about team composition. So in the pre-intervention contest, we had DD sort of one thing that they abandoned from the first experiment was our pairwise battles contest format. They said it was too complicated, so they opted for the best of 5. So each leaderboard consisted of 5 teams, and the best of the 5 in terms of total revenue got the cash prize. So this is before our intervention. So this is how they always run the team contests on the platform. And the reward amount was 1,000 yuan for Beijing teams and 650 for Taiyuan Kunming. So these are normalized based on the city-specific income per hour. The revenue calculation is the total revenue of the top 6 drivers in a 7-driver team. And so the reason for this rule, which seems somewhat arbitrary, was because in Beijing, for example, for each license plate, there's 1 day that you cannot get on the road. So that's mainly used to control for pollution. So that was the reason for this rule. And this contest was used to, form teams and enhance team identity. And when the intervention starts, this is a mock-up of the interface that the driver sees on the app. By the end of the day, if you're in the team leaderboard treatment, so remember, the intervention went for 3 weeks. The intervention only has ranking information. There's no cash prize, but each driver still earns piece rate. And the piece rate arrangement is for every trip, the driver gets 80% of the revenue and the company, the platform, gets 20%. And so I can talk about revenue or income, driver income, or platform profit. They sort of all mean the same thing. So you see the team ranking on your leaderboard. If you tap your own team's name, you will see the individual ranking within the team. So this is the team leaderboard condition. For the individual leaderboard treatment, you only see the individual ranking in your team. And if you're in the control condition, you see your own name and the revenue you accumulated for that day. So this is the iteration of what did we vary in the treatment. And it's essentially team ranking or individual ranking or no ranking. Okay. And afterwards, there was a post-intervention contest, which is exactly the same as the pre-intervention contest. And there was a survey which was used to probe some of the mechanisms for the team contest. So we pre-registered our hypotheses and analysis plan. So they concern the average treatment effect in revenue ranking. So we expect treated drivers to do better than drivers in the control condition. And this is based on a lot of prior research on identity in teams. And we expect team leaderboard to be doing better than individual leaderboard in terms of the ranking. And for this, there's no theoretical model that gives us this prediction, but so this is based on 2 lab experiments. We expect the treatment to have a persistent effect in the post-intervention contest, and that it should have an effect for retention. And the leadership hypotheses were essentially that it's not about treatment effect, but it's something that we thought was interesting, so we pre-registered it. Now I'm going to go through the results. So I'll first show 3 graphs, and then I'll show the regression analysis. So this is the effect of status contests on revenue in Taiyuan. What you see here are the bars indicate time period. So the blue bar, the light blue bar, is the status contest. So this is our intervention. And we normalize the revenues by the 2 weeks prior. So you can think of this as a visual of the difference in differences analysis. The red line is the team leaderboard intervention. The blue one is the individual leaderboard, and the dotted line is the control condition. So it looks like that the team leaderboard did better in Taiyuan, and individual leaderboard is very similar to the control condition. And we'll see the statistics afterwards. After the experiment, what you see is essentially the seasonal effect. So this peak is the end of the fiscal year, December 31st. That's when a lot of incentives were put into place to get the drivers to meet certain goals. Then afterwards, this is when the Chinese New Year was coming up. So you see a dip because people go home. It turns out in Beijing, you actually get the reversal. So in Beijing, the condition that was the best performing condition was the individual leaderboard, and team and control didn't seem to be different. In Kunming, even though it looks like the team leaderboard did better, nothing was significant. So I'm going to test each of the hypotheses. So the first one is about the average treatment effect. So we use panel regressions with city fix effects. So this is the first part on treated drivers versus those in the other control conditions. So the treated drivers, so this is the changes in weekly revenue in Chinese yuan. Here's the standard errors. So standard errors are in parentheses. What's in the square bracket is the false discovery rate adjusted Q values to control for multiple hypothesis testing. So, and then we can control for covariates. So the first one is that, yes, treated drivers are more productive during the contest than those in the control condition. And so the covariates we control for are the driver's age, the DD age, which is the number of years they've worked for DD, hometown distance, so where they were born from the contest city. So we have their ID number, national ID number, so we know the code for their hometown where they were born. And this was a surprise, which is self-formed teams compared to algorithm-formed teams actually is always negative. So we don't have a good sense of why that's the case. One conjecture is that self-formed teams were not there to maximize revenue, probably, but we don't have a definitive answer. What's interesting is that you see that in other regressions as well, that hometown distance is negative in the sense that if you were born from far away, you are sort of, you might be less, you might feel less affiliated to your team. And this is true in Taiyuan, significant in Taiyuan. In the second test, we look at the team leaderboard and individual leaderboard separately. And so what you see here is this is something that we did not register, and we completely did not expect it, is that the cities responded very differently. So we didn't anticipate the heterogeneous effects across different cities. So what you see here is what you also saw in the graph, is that Taiyuan drivers, were motivated by the team leaderboard, whereas Beijing drivers were motivated by the individual leaderboard. But because Beijing is a much larger city, it contributes most drivers to the contest. If you take, put all of them together, you will see that the individual leaderboard actually has a significant effect. But the two mechanisms do not perform differently, except in Taiyuan, and that's marginal. So let me summarize the contest effect on productivity, the virtual teams and productivity. So overall, treated drivers are 1.7% more productive, or they generate 1.7% higher revenue. And that, team leaderboard on average has a 1.8% difference. Individual leaderboard is about 2%. At the city level, when you disaggregate, you see that team leaderboard had a 5.3% increase in driver revenue, whereas Beijing is 2.3. Nothing is ever significant in Kunming. So are these big effects or small effects? If you think about the nature of the intervention, this is really, in the class of information intervention. So we basically feed them the ranking information of their teams, which should make the team identity more salient, or ranking among individuals. So there is a recent meta-analysis by Stefano Della Vigna and co-authors, where they look at not just published interventions, information nudges in academic journals, but also the nudge units from different governments, such as the UK governments, the White House nudge units. These studies were carefully designed and conducted, but were not published. So if you look at this entire corpus of work, the effect size is very consistent with the meta-analysis. So this is the effect size that you see in information interventions. So next we look at the persistence. When the 3-week intervention was over, everybody participated in a 1-week contest for cash prize. So one punchline of this paper is, after the intervention is over, team leaderboard is the only thing that mattered. So team leaderboard continued to do well. In Kunming, in Taiyuan, there's actually an adverse effect, if you will. Individual leaderboard actually make people sort of lead to lower revenue. And if you look at, for instance, the Moldovano et al. Theory paper on status contests across individuals, the way they model the contest utility, the status utility, is the number of people below you minus the number of people above you. So, and empirical studies show that it's not a linear effect. So you could get, on aggregate, a negative effect on the individual leaderboard, which we see here. So to summarize, in the week afterwards, team leaderboard generates about 2.5% higher revenue compared to those in the control condition, and individual leaderboard had no effect. This is on retention. So I want to talk just a little bit about the metrics for retention. So in a brick and mortar world, when our coworker quits, she packs up her desk, submits the key and leaves the office. It's a binary decision. Whereas in the gig economy, we talked to our DD colleagues, they said that actually nobody ever deletes the app. They just stop taking orders. And so we decided to define retention as essentially the number of days per week, that you actually took at least one order. And we have the data until 3 months after. And the dip here you see is the Chinese New Year, the 2 weeks of vacation. So this is retention a week after the experiment. And so essentially this is roughly an hour. So people treated under the team leaderboard condition works roughly an hour longer. And it's completely driven by Taiyuan drivers, and they're, work 4 hours longer per week, essentially. If you look at 3 months after the experiment, the effect is still there, and the effect size is very similar to the 1 week after. So to summarize, up to 3 months after the experiment, drivers in the team leaderboard treatment work on average an hour longer per week than those in the control condition, and Taiyuan drivers work 3 hours longer per week, whereas Beijing and Kunming do not behave differently. And the last result that I'm going to present is, who wants to be leaders? We look at, basically what this says, this is not any treatment effect. It's, people who were more productive, who have served as captains before, and who are more experienced, who's been at DD for a longer period of time, are more likely to volunteer to be captains. We did robustness checks by, so captains were more productive by excluding all the captains, and all the results hold. And then we also separately look at the above versus below median drivers. We did not pre-register this, but we were, these are exploratory analysis. It turns out that the below median drivers were those benefited most from the team contests. So in the survey, we wanted to explore some of the mechanisms. It turned out that we didn't have a very good response rate, so only 15% responded, and they're not a random sample. But of those who responded, 92%, so that's about 4,000 some drivers, 92% liked the contest, and we asked them why you like it. So the top 3 reasons are, team belonging, making friends, and the sense of honor from winning. We also asked them about communication. So 80%, so these are not mutually exclusive, but 80% of those who responded said that they communicated by WeChat, so which is, the super app, which it's like, I don't know, Facebook, Amazon, PayPal combined. So 80% of them said that they use WeChat, and 25% that they meet face-to-face after the contest. So let me just quickly summarize the results. That we find that team contest increases driver productivity, but when you take the cash incentive away and just look at status contests, we find that team leaderboard has a significant effect in Taiyuan and is marginally significant overall. Individual leaderboard, is significant in Beijing and overall significant during the contest. In terms of retention, team leaderboard has a significant effect up to 3 months after. And I also want to, we don't have, treatment effect on emotional well-being. So this is based on our survey results, which is drivers say that they, what that enabled them to do is to be connected with other drivers, and that they could learn how to take orders, what type of orders to take from more experienced drivers, and that enable them to find friends. So this we find in our survey from both waves, and also in our interview with the drivers. I want to briefly mention the difference between Beijing and Taiyuan. So one metric that we have is that the average distance of the driver's hometown to the contest city was 100 kilometers in Taiyuan, which means that drivers are primarily local, whereas it's 350 kilometers in Beijing. which sort of is consistent with the demographic information that most people living in Beijing are actually not from Beijing. And so that might explain why the team leaderboards didn't do quite as well as the individual leaderboard, but it's not a definitive explanation. So this is all I have. So thank you very much for the. I'm going to take questions for the questions in between, and I also I'm not very good at monitoring the chat. Okay, so
Oh, no, there are some questions. I would let Robin Keller speak. Robin, please.
Okay, you guys hear me?
yes,
Thank you.
Okay. Well, the first question related to the specific times, like New Year's Eve, and whether or not the rate per trip goes up on New Year's Eve. I think Uber would charge more, and thus they'd make more if they did a trip on those peak load times. So that was one question. And then I also remembered Colin Kammerer had an old, I think it was him and some co-authors on taxi drivers in New York City. And
Yeah.
with different incentives, they worked harder.
Yeah.
So those are just vague questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So so both Uber and Lyft use surge pricing. So when demand is high, the rate goes up. Uber was competing with Didi in China for a while until it pulled out. And so after Uber pulled out, the interesting part is that when Uber and Didi were competing, they engaged in Bertrand competition, which is, they did price competition. So price was really low. And after Uber pulled out, Didi started to use surge pricing because it became a monopolist in 399 cities in China. The only serious competition was in Shanghai. Meituan was also in ride sharing. So it started to use surge pricing for a while, and consumers were furious. So they got these huge backlashes on social media. So they pulled surge pricing and replaced it with a queuing mechanism. So if you open up your app during rush hours, it might say that, okay, your request is your consumer number 39. The estimated waiting time is 45 minutes. And by that time, you might just take public transportation or walk. That explains the gap, the 10% gap in Beijing and Taipei. So they didn't use, they were essentially they were beaten back by the consumers. And so they did not use surge pricing. But they have other type of short-term incentives. So for the New Year's Eve, the end of year peak, we don't know specifically what incentives were given in each city, but there might be other type of bonuses for driving during that time. For the taxi driver, the Kammerer et al.'s taxi driver paper, they essentially establish reference dependence among the New York City taxi drivers, and that was verified in a number of other studies. So do Didi drivers exhibit the same type of reference dependent utility? There is a recent working paper by Zhen Meng from Peking University which established this. So in this one, we don't really go into, we don't have the data to the variation to estimate preferences, but Meng et al.'s paper did that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Great.
Thank you.
We have a question also from Ilya.
Hi, Ilya.
Oh, 1 second. Yeah, hi. And yeah, so my question was because it looks like everything you discussed is about mostly increasing productivity, and productivity not in terms of, I don't know, working smarter or something, but kind of increasing just driving time. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe from the platform point of view, it's fine, but you kind of started with saying, okay, they need some some connection with others, whatever, maybe status, maybe some, anyway, well-being. So it looked like it's not so much monetary. And I think there are many stories that drivers kind of overwork. So I don't know, you say, okay, it increases by like 4 hours per week. That's sort of the best. But I don't know how much, well, I guess it varies, but how much they work, right? Because some drivers work like 20 hours per day. And so I don't know, it could be some other objective or some other kind of benefits. So for example, I don't know, more of friends of the driver subscribe or whatever, right? Yeah. So just overall, right, it could be that maybe the objective is that they don't drive too much.
Yeah.
So around this.
Yeah, thank you. We're very aware that we don't have very good data on other dimensions such as communication, emotional well-being, and learning. So those all depend on the survey data, and our survey response rate were 25% and 15% on at each of the surveys. So it's not great data on that dimension. So the platform does have a 10-hour limit per day, so you cannot drive more than 10 hours. That's still pretty long. So the question is, is longer hours better for the driver's well-being? So we actually can't answer that question. So the only thing that we know is that from the survey that they feel more connected with other drivers. So there's one question which asks, if we're doing this again, do you want to be in the same team? Do you want to have long-term teams, or do you want to have a new team every time? And more than 90% of the drivers say that they prefer to be in the same team because they have friends. Yeah, I think I'm using up my time. Yeah, so that's, thank you.
There is a further question by David Budescu.
Okay.
So I just wanted to refer to, at the beginning, we talked about social identity, and you may remember in social identity, to create similar groups, the similarity can be minimal, right? The minimal group situation. And I wonder to what degree, your choice to use hometown or age is necessary. You could have achieved actually almost similar results by a survey and telling people we are grouping you with others who answer to this questionnaire of preferences or things they like similarly to you. And so I think it's interesting to establish what are the necessary conditions for a similarity that defines effective teams, as well as what is the optimal group of teams, optimal size. Of
yeah. So that's an excellent question. So there's a lot of not surprisingly, the first wave of lab experiments in economics on social identity use the minimum group paradigm from social psychology. And what we have, so the difference is that in most economic games, there are, so Tashfeld and Turner established 4 conditions for the minimum group. The last condition is almost always verified. So there's almost always a trade-off between the person's decision maker's own interests and others' interests. And when that is present, the minimum group doesn't always work in the lab. So now we have accumulated enough evidence on the type of economically interesting games where the minimum group works versus when it doesn't work. Could you do that in the field? So we are working with Lyft to try to implement the same set of experiments among Lyft drivers this coming fall. We might be able to look at different ways of doing team formation, such as using something like the minimum group. We're not. So that's open. That's completely open. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions?
I have one. Is the second experiment, teams were self-assembled, right? So the results in the first experiment were better because teams were engineered better than with self-assembly. It's not clear that you will get optimal teams in terms of similarity or what have you.
Yes.
So that.
Yeah. So the first experiment is definitely cleaner from that perspective. In the second experiment, we don't have control over team formation. So 36% of the teams are self-formed. And the algorithm was involved in 64% of the teams.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I do not know if there are any questions. I think we could still use another minute or two of our speaker if there are. Okay, otherwise, really big thank Yan and Professor Chen for being here. Thank you very much and welcome, and thank you all of you for being here. And I wish you a blessed continuation of your spring and summer. Good work for Yan, and good luck on your first flight after so much, because you're leaving to New York in a few minutes. So that's going to be a change.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emanuele, for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for the great questions.
Yes.
Very helpful comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Yan, for accepting, and thank you all for being here. It's been a wonderful webinar, and let's renew the appointment to our next Decision Analysis Society webinar that will come in the fall. Thank you, Yan. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Bye to everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.